All right. So just a couple questions, and you can just feel free to just speak out the answers. What is a time in your life when you experienced a sudden change in fortunes?
Pardon, would you say the question again?
Yeah. What is a time in your life where you experienced a sudden change in fortunes?
Well, for me, it was when I went through my divorce, and then it changed a few years later when I met my current husband, and that whole period between the divorce and that was such a growing period in my faith, where I really had to have that hope and rely on my faith, because it was really, really hard.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing.
Mine
Yes.
would be the death of my husband and the renewing of my faith at that time.
If you're talking about monetary fortune, it would be my started my first job and getting a regular paycheck.
What was that first job?
Working for Delta Airlines in Chicago.
It can be monetary or not monetary, but yeah, that is a significant change in life when you get that first job.
Yeah, for me, it was moving down here for my job I had for 30 years down here from Duluth. So even though I had been in the service for 4 years previous, so it was still a time to get myself together and go for the rest of my life.
Absolutely.
I'd say for me, it was Lisa and I were both graduate students at the University of Minnesota and overlapping, and she wrapped up a year ahead of me. And after I finished up, we looked for a place to live, and we ended up in Mounds View, of all places. And we still went to church in Roseville, where we went as graduate students. And once our son Ryan was born, we thought, well, it'd be good for him to go to Sunday school with kids he goes to school with, and we ended up inviting Savior. So I would say that was a tremendous change of fortune for us.
I guess I would say mine was the very sudden death of my mother. She had rheumatoid arthritis for years, but what happened was she had a massive stroke and died within a few hours the day before my 25th birthday. So that was a real shock, and took me years to get over that. My father's death was very different. My mother was just 58 years old, and my father lived to be almost 90. And his death was such a different experience because I knew it was coming, and we'd had many talks about it. And but my mother's death was just a real shocker and very hard to get over.
I think to answer the question for myself, I think probably one of the biggest changes in fortune is we watched a lot of our friends have difficulty starting a family, and some of them not able to at all. And we were able to have 3 little kids, and they changed our lives completely. It's interesting to think about. It was interesting to talk to some of our friends that had a hard time with it, and think about like the time that we had with it, and just everything that goes along with kids and all of that. It was a big change. So, well, as you read the book of Esther, as almost everybody got a chance to read it, or maybe you've heard it or read it in the past as well in your life, and it's familiar. Was there anything that stood out to you, especially if you just recently reread it? Maybe something you didn't notice before, or
in the beginning of the book, they had lots of parties where everybody was eating for days.
It was quite a process to get these girls ready to present themselves to the king. I mean, the facial creams and the special diets and everything like that. It just a lot of, I don't know what you want to call it.
Nonsense.
yeah.
To please the man. At the beginning of it too, I guess I was kind of surprised that the queen, even when she was queen, had to wait for the king to call her in. She just couldn't go in and talk to him.
Yeah, it's very different than the way we think about communication today. Send somebody a text message, done.
A verse that I've got it underlined in my body, in my Bible. It's in the 4th chapter, and my vision isn't really good. So, but it's near the beginning of the 5th chapter. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. This was a verse that was quoted to me when I was being encouraged to be president of the congregation, and I felt very inadequate. And it was a time of kind of a transitional time, and we needed to kind of pull together at that time. So that verse was quoted to me. Maybe you have come, because I'm kind of a peacemaker type, and sort of a calm personality. And so this verse was quoted to me as an encouragement for me to consent to be president of the congregation.
That's really neat. Yeah, that's great. I think are you talking about? I think it's was it verse 12 through the end of the chapter? I think.
I need really good light to see those little numbers in my Bible, and I can't see it. It's just up from chapter 5, a few verses.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's the end of verse 14.
All right. Well, let's dive into it a little bit. So I kind of have this broken out into three kind of sections. I'm calling this a study on Mordecai, and that's a little bit of a tease because it's the book of Esther, right? And it kind of to pique our interest because we don't often necessarily look at Mordecai, but obviously we're looking at Mordecai and Esther. And so I kind of wanted to break this out into three kind of sections. So in interpreting the Bible, sometimes it's helpful to think about it like a triangle. And on each point of the triangle, like one point you have your history on one side of the triangle. On one point you have your like literature. You're looking at the Bible as a piece of literary work. And then on the other point of the triangle, you have your theology and your kind of like, so what does this mean for our lives? So I want to talk about the first point of the top of the triangle first, the history piece. And if you have a study Bible, if you have a Bible like this one here is a great one. It's the Lutheran Study Bible. There's some really great stuff in the beginning of Esther that gives you a little bit about the backdrop of Esther. So the setting of Esther is the Persian Empire. And if we think about kind of the timeline of empires that move along through the history of people, really, we have the Egyptian Empire. It's kind of maybe one of the first main empires around the time of Moses. And then after that, we move into the Assyrian Empire. And then we move into the Babylonian Empire. And then following the Babylonian Empire is when the Persian Empire comes along. It's roughly about the year 559 to 331 BC. And the end of the Persian Empire kind of ends with the Greek Empire, and then later the Roman or the Greco-Roman Empire, which is probably I think it's the most lengthy empire that's ever ruled the world. So that's kind of historically where we're talking about. The Persian Empire is actually, it's really interesting. They are throughout all of, if you compare them to the Syrians or the Babylonians, they are extremely tolerant. They're extremely diverse. They're very, very permissive about letting the people that they take into captivity do their own thing and maintain their own identity. As long as it doesn't threaten or interfere with their kind of world domination that they're doing. But the Persians in particular were kind of really, really more so than the Greeks, more so than especially the Assyrians or the Egyptians, very permissive, very much, you're the Jewish people, we've taken over you, but you do your own thing. You have your own temple, you take care of your things, and we're not going to get involved in it. As long as there's not any insurrections or rebellions or anything like that. So that is kind of interesting to note that in the kind of backdrop. That's kind of what's happening behind the scenes here, so to speak. And so this is a time where the Jewish people are they're basically scattered throughout the world. There's no longer like a centralized location of the Jews at this point. And so with the Jews being scattered, there's some tension in being in different areas. The capital city is Susa. That's where the main concentration of Jews are at this time. And there's this tension of keeping their own identity, who they are as the Jewish people, and then also the broader Persian culture, and all the other different types of people that they interact with at this time. So that's a little bit about the Persian Empire. Historically, the way that Israel worked, and the way that Israel basically had a job function. Their job function was to be a light to all other people. They were supposed to live in a way that showed the rest of the world who God was, how loving God was, how merciful God was. And that was like their job description. And they oftentimes did not do this so well. They would go in these cycles. So Israel would have a good king and a good leader, and they would do really well at this. And then the next king would come along and they would start worshiping idols. And then they would go through this cycle where God judged them and punished them, and foreign leaders would come in and carry off large parts of them and put them in captivity. And then they would experience something great, and they would be liberated from that, and the cycle would start all over again. Now, it's kind of interesting to note that if we think about Jesus, and we're not really going to talk about Jesus much, and this is probably the only instance in this one, but the job that Israel has to do, they can never do, and they always fail at it. And that's to be a light to the rest of the world. This is actually the job that when Jesus comes onto the picture, Jesus actually takes on this mantle, so to speak, takes this job description on. Jesus is, his job is to show the world what kind of God is God, how God views humanity, how God loves the world. And Jesus actually takes Israel's job on, and actually is the first time that the job ever gets done correctly, so to speak. So a little bit of a different way to think about it, maybe. But that's the function of Israel in history and throughout history, and the cycles that they go through. The third kind of thing to note, just about to give yourself a little backdrop of the time of Esther, is this festival that is still celebrated today. It's actually will be celebrated next month by Jews all over the world, and it's called the Festival of Purim. And the word pur in Hebrew is lot, or lots, so it's the Festival of Lots. And lots would be casting dice, games of chance, things like that. So the Feast of Lots is it's about the survival of Jews under Persian rulers, and about surviving. It's about celebrating surviving Haman, who is kind of our antagonist, our villain in this story. So the Festival of Purim gets celebrated every year. It's a 2-day event. There's fasting the day before, and then there's a big celebration, kind of a carnival. If you go to temple, they would read Esther out loud, and Esther is actually meant to. It's kind of interesting. The way that Esther was written, it was really meant to be read out loud, and it's meant to be almost like people will shout during the parts, like, when Haman comes on the scene, it's like people will yell like boo, and when Esther and Mordecai come into the picture, it's yay. And so it almost has like it's written like a play in a sense, for people to get really into that. And this happens every year still today in Jewish temples. They actually, I thought this was interesting. They make these little 3-cornered pastries, and they're called Haman Taschen, which means Haman's ears. And they still make these and eat these during Purim today. So that's a little bit about the history of Esther, what's going on behind the scenes, the historical aspects about it. Any questions about that part of it? All right. So the next piece I think to look at is the literature aspect of Esther, of the story of Mordecai, and to look at the characters. So we basically have 5 main characters in this story. We have the king. Does anybody know how to say the king's name?
I just call him the king.
Yeah. I feel like that's what I heard growing up. They just called him the king. I think it's Ahasuerus, but I don't know how to pronounce it. It's quite the mouthful. And if you have the NIV, it'll say Xerxes. But if you have like the Lutheran Study Bible, it has Ahasuerus. Ahasuerus, I think, something like that. So we have the king. We have Haman, and Haman is like our main antagonist. He's the bad guy. He's the king's chief official. He's Persian. We don't really know his ethnicity, but he doesn't represent the Jews in any way. He represents the Persian government. And then we have our kind of happy good characters. We have Mordecai, who he's Jewish faith, and he's a local leader. So he's involved in government. He's involved in what's going on. He's highly respected, and he's kind of the supporting protagonist of the story. And then we have Esther, Esther is kind of our main protagonist in the story. She is kind of Mordecai's adopted daughter. I think technically, though, they're cousins, but I think there's a good deal of distance in age between them. So I think I just think about it, it's easy to think about her as like she's an adopted daughter of Mordecai. She's also Jewish, of course, in faith and in culture. And then we have our fifth main character, who is kind of more of a minor character. So those are really the main four, but is Queen Vashti. And she is the queen of Persia and the wife of, well, the first wife, or the first one we get introduced to in the story, of the king of Ahasuerus. And that basically represents our main characters in the story. Just to read kind of a summary of the story. And this was written by Diane Jacobson, a professor of Old Testament. Ahasuerus, all-powerful king of Persia, banishes his queen Vashti for failing to appear before him when bidden. The new chosen queen is Esther, cousin and adopted daughter of Mordecai. Mordecai's bitter enemy at court is the wicked Haman, the king's right-hand man. Because Mordecai fails to bow before him, Haman plots not only Mordecai's death, but also the extermination of every single Jew. Mordecai calls on Queen Esther to save her people. Esther heroically risks the king's wrath by appearing unbidden or unannounced before him. She invites King Ahasuerus and Haman to two separate banquets, where she persuades the king both to save her people and also to hang Haman on the very gallows that he constructed for Mordecai. The king's edict to kill all of the Jews is reversed, and the Jews instead get revenge on their would-be persecutors, and they celebrate, initiating the festival of Purim. So kind of a summary of Esther in a 10-second reading there. Any questions about the story so far, or anything I've said?
No.
All right.
Lots of violence,
Yes.
lots of killing and violence.
Yes.
Yeah, really. Like if you look at chapters 9 and 10, there's a lot of talk about violence, and we'll talk about that in the theology section a little bit. But yeah, there's kind of problematic violence. All right. So moving on, about when did the story, the setting take place? We think that it was during the reign of the Persian king Xerxes. Interesting, the original text calls the king Ahasuerus, but there's no historical record of anyone with that name ever. It probably has a reference to King Xerxes the first, or Artaxerxes, his successor. But because of that, we know that the book of Esther was probably written actually right before Jesus comes on the scene. It was written. It may be, only so far through the Old Testament, but it was written way at the end of the Old Testament. Probably one of the latest, if not latest, writings. Was anybody raised Catholic, or does anybody have any? Has anyone ever heard of the book of Susanna or the book of Judith? No? Okay. So if you have a Catholic Bible, or if you were raised Catholic, you might know of these. So there was the book of Esther, and then these two other books, and they're all kind of written around the same time. And all three books feature women prominently as leaders in the books. So if you really liked Esther and the style of writing, kind of interesting to maybe check those two out. So Judith and Susanna are the names of those books. We don't know who wrote the book of Esther at all. There's really no indication or hints about who may have written it. And it has, kind of, as you guys have noticed, it has a very, it has a silly, like lighthearted, humorous kind of tone to it. The whole first chapter with the descriptions about having parties for days and days on end. And even the gallows that are built, if you look up like the cubits reference, the gallows built are 75 feet tall. So like, right, these enormous gallows that everything is, you know, this huge language. So it kind of has like it has a humorous tone to it a little bit. Irony is definitely used. It's a very ironic story. There's reversals in the story where you expect something to happen, and especially Haman. I mean, he had everything all planned out, and the whole thing gets reversed on him in the end. But it's meant to encourage and to teach us how to live with these ideas of having governments that rule over us, and also the tension of we are God's chosen faithful people, and how do we resolve that tension. So that's kind of one of the big themes in Esther for sure. One thing that you may have noticed or you may have heard before too about Esther is that it is the only book in all of the scriptures, Old or New Testament, that never ever references God's name once at all. It's not in the book Esther at all, which is interesting. They call it a secular writing, and there was a lot of debate when the early church was putting together the Bible whether Esther actually should even be in the Bible, because they said, well, it's a Jewish writing and it's about a festival, and God is not mentioned a single time in it. So that's kind of an interesting little side note if you had never noticed that before. So some questions for you. I know I've been talking a lot for the last few minutes, but let's have some discussion here. How do you see hope in this story? How do you see hope in Mordecai or in Esther? Is there any?
I had wondered how this is relevant to hope. So somebody help me.
Well, don't you think part of it is that by her becoming a favorite of the king, that maybe she felt she could help her people? And Mordecai definitely felt that through her, there was hope in helping the Jewish people.
I'm reading, I have, this is a new Bible I just got for Christmas, the Help Finders Bible. And they have something in little at the bottom that says Esther and Mordecai believed that God would deliver his people, but they did more than sit around and wait for it to happen. Although God is sovereign, he works out his will through the gifts, opportunities, and actions of his people. Many people believe God's promises, but hesitate to get involved. But Esther approached the king, and Mordecai carried out her instructions. Don't wait for God's will to be accomplished without your contribution. Get involved and enjoy the results of sharing in God's purpose. So to me, that's kind of that hope that I can do something, instead of waiting. If we know it's God's will, we should take action. I think we kind of talked about that last week, that joy and hope are active. They're not passive. So I don't know if that helps you, Cheryl. That's all I got.
Yeah, I think that's great. Definitely. That's a huge theme, is that there's that scene too where Mordecai is pleading with Esther to go and, to use her as effectively like her privilege, her power, to go and use it, and to at the same time put her life at risk. The king could have had her executed for showing up unannounced, but to do something, and she does, and I think it's really inspiring and hopeful.
And that's when that verse comes in, when Mordecai is trying to convince her to go ahead and you know, maybe this is what you have been destined to do, or whatever those words are.
Yeah. In chapter 4, where it says, "Who knows, perhaps you have come to royal dignity for just such a time as this."
That's Mordecai talking to her.
Yeah. So I
And
mentioned, oh, go ahead.
she had hope too that somehow he would accept her coming unannounced. So she had hope and courage too, of course, but
Huge. Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of hope in the story, in that things look really bad for not just Mordecai, but all of the Jewish people. A decree goes out. I mean, imagine getting that in the mail, you know, hey, by the way, all Christians in the United States, we're going to line you up for execution. Like that kind of like news, you know, it's horrible. It's shocking. It's awful. And yet, even in the midst of it, Mordecai has hope. Esther has hope, and they really stick themselves out there. And without that hope, I mean, what would they have done? Everyone would have sat in mourning and accepted their fate. So I think it's like that piece of the story is just incredibly hopeful. So even though, as I mentioned, God isn't mentioned by name, so Yahweh, the name doesn't show up in the story at all. What are some key moments that you saw God providing hope? Where do we see God in this story, maybe, is the question.
Putting Esther in the position where she could help.
I mean, yeah, even in the beginning too, when the king decides to he gets rid of his first wife because she won't listen to him, and even just finding Esther in the first place, it's kind of like God's hand is working in all these like things that seem like they're coincidences, right? There's all these like kind of happy coincidences in the story. So have you ever broken like a cultural norm, a social norm, a rule, a law to do the right thing? And if you did, what happened? Does anything come to mind for anybody?
Well, with my son that was raised good Lutheran, he married a Catholic and converted. And he said, "Don't worry, Dad. You can take a boy out of the Lutheran church, but you can't take the Lutheran church out of the boy."
That's funny.
Well, I think about when David and I were first married, and he was working at a very small church in Two Harbors. He was doing their youth ministry program, and the pastor was really upset that I was working because wives should be at home raising their children.
Mm.
And that was in the 70s. So, you know, it was fairly well accepted at that time for women to work outside the home, but I did feel a lot of pressure. And I just kind of always tried to do what I think is right, and sometimes that falls outside the norm.
That's a great example. Yeah. There are probably, if we think about them, a lot of instances of where we've done things that don't look socially acceptable or are frowned upon, or people raise their eyebrows. But you know, we know in our hearts that it's the right thing to do, and I that's kind of where I'm going with that, is just that those situations are difficult and awkward and uncomfortable, but when we reflect back on them, a lot of times, like, it can actually be a big source of hope in our own lives, is just looking at how God shows up in those times, as in the story of Mordecai here. How do you view God's activity in your life? Do you see God as like active in orchestrating all the events and things that happen, or do you see God as more of like a background character, kind of will occasionally pop up into your life? Or do you have any specific examples of either one?
Well, I think there have been things that have happened in my life that were probably controlled by God, or God had an influence in the things that have happened in my life.
Anything come to mind, Arden?
Well, I think back when things were starting in the Vietnam War, I had an injury that kept me out of the Army, because I was sure I was getting drafted and going to go to Vietnam, and I had an injury that kept me out of the Army, and I felt like that God had a control of my body when that injury happened. And that's actually, I feel like that saved me, probably saved my life.
Wow.
I'm kind of mixed on it. I mean, I always share with my kids that there's many doors in life, and I don't think there's any absolute one right door, but you go through it and there you are on the other side, and then there's a whole another pile of doors in front of you. So that's been kind of my approach to life in general. And I think, I don't know that God has said that I've ever felt go through this door, but there's doors there. And so I guess for me, there's faith that knowing God is with me, whatever door I go through. So that's been kind of how I view my journey in life. I don't feel that it's been orchestrated, but I think there's opportunities, and I don't know whether God provides those opportunities or not, but they're opportunities nonetheless, and they're there, and I go by faith through a door. I think, but then there's certain instances of life where I wonder if there must have been some divine intervention. I mean, a very telling one for me was a near fatal collision, 16 years ago, just right up on Highway 10. I was driving up to go hunting, meeting a buddy up in Elk River, and it's 4 a.m, and I'm heading north on 10, and I'm coming up over the hill on 7th Avenue there, and I'm passing a car on my right. I look in the mirror, I see I'm past him, I go to signal right, and I look up and there's a set of headlights in front of me. I cut the wheel hard over, and the guy's mirror cut into my left front bumper of my truck. And I jerked the wheel so hard to the right that I should have lost control, but his car helped straighten me out. And the only thing that happened to my vehicle was it blew up my tire. I mean, it darn near totaled the vehicle, but I walked away, I changed my tire, and I was still able to drive home. And the other gentleman's vehicle got disabled who was going the wrong way. So I don't know, maybe there was some divine intervention there, because so I go both ways. So, sometimes I think God's there, but other times, I feel like he's just saying, I gave you a brain, Jim, go figure it out. So.
Wow. That's quite the story, Jim. Holy cow.
Well, and after it was done, I figured there must be some reason for why I'm still here. And I don't know what that, I always thought there'd be one defining moment, but I don't think there is. I raised my kids, I was able to be with my dad, so I don't think there's one defining moment. But yet there's still, God is there. So.
Thank you. Yeah.
Well, I'm going to be 90 years old this summer now on my birthday. And as I look back, and especially now when I've had more time to kind of reflect back on my life, I can see so many instances where I was either protected or in one case, it was a no answer that I thought was, I didn't understand why it was a no answer, but looking back now, I would not be in the position I am financially. It had to do with, I was teaching part-time, and our school district decided that all the special ed people had to be full-time. And we had just adopted our second boy from Korea. And it meant for me going back to school and working full-time, and it just seemed totally wrong to me. And I prayed and prayed that I wouldn't have to do that. But my husband said, well, we're going to need a lot of money later on, so I think you're going to have to do this. Meaning I had to teach full-time, had two sons that we had adopted from Korea, and take classes at the university, evening classes, and keep the household going. And that was a no answer. But looking back now, I see that if I hadn't done that, I would not be in the financial position that I am now. I didn't know that I'd be going through a divorce, and I didn't know what the future held, but I have a nice retirement now, a teacher retirement check coming along with Social Security. And I just thank God so many times for that no answer. It was some tough years and a lot of hard work, but it's made my life so much better now. And I can thank God for that no answer.
Thank you for sharing that. I think these are all great stories. I mean, they like the story of Esther, the story of Mordecai, the story that Jim shared, the story that Margaret shared. Like these are the stories I think that give us hope. And there's all kinds of like really hard stuff peppered in there. There's hard stuff peppered into the story of Esther, and there's difficult things that we've all been through, but yet we found hope in these different times, which is that's awesome.
When my granddaughter, who is now 18, and she was probably about maybe in second grade, I was her Sunday school teacher that year. I think it was first grade. I was her Sunday school teacher. I kind of got And because the teacher that started it ended up quitting a few weeks in, so I said, yes, I would take over. And the one Sunday, we studied Daniel and the lion's den and talked about that and kind of acted it out. Well, that week, my daughter, with the two little girls in the back, was rear-ended by this man on university who went into an epileptic seizure. He actually wasn't supposed to be driving a car, but his vehicle went right underneath theirs. Well, my daughter was injured. Luckily, you know, she was okay, but she had to spend a couple days in the hospital. But they brought the little girls, one was older, but the first grader, in the ambulance with their mother because there wasn't anybody to take them. And so then I got the call and I rushed to the hospital. And my little granddaughter, who was in first grade, said, "Grandma, look what the fireman gave me." And it was a little stuffed lion. Coincidence or what? But you're just, you know, it struck her because we had just read that story and she'd been in that accident and these firefighters had been so kind to her. And then she got this lion and I just looked at her. I said, "What do you think about that, Annika?" And she's like, just hugging this, you know, and it was that, just that source of comfort to her. And that, yeah, God, you know, my mom's in the hospital here, but God's still watching over us.
That's cool. So how can we take Mordecai's life, or anything that happened with Esther in the story, and apply it to our own lives? What is the like hopeful story in this? Rather than just give you the answer, I thought I'd maybe ask, like, where do you see this apply in your life?
Probably it'll all turn out with God's guidance. It'll turn out correct. It'll turn out well. And going back, I mean, I think God looking over my shoulder for a lot of things. And yeah, I could have taken it hard, but no. Even Pastor Larry Getty had said that I did the right thing.
I think for me, the answer that I might give to that question is, I think a lot of times I struggle with, and probably you struggle with, like you asked this question, like, where is God? Like is God real? What is God up to? Like we don't see the clouds open up. We don't see a megaphone come out of God's voice blasting at us, telling us what to do. And sometimes it's hard to have faith, and we get discouraged. And it doesn't seem like God's maybe there at all. And you have this whole story of these people running around, you know, getting rid of queens, getting new queens, trying to kill people. Other people are going to be killed. Well, there's a lot of chance in this story. Like they're casting lots all the time for outcomes of things. Everything seems kind of really up in the air in this story, and God's name doesn't get mentioned once. And so we have that kind of on the one hand, but we have God's people in this story, the Jews, they're saved. They're completely saved from being wiped out. And we have these stories that we just shared with each other of where basically like these are stories of being saved. You know, Ellen, your story is a perfect example of like being saved from near death. So we see God everywhere at the same time. God is in all kinds of different things. God's moving and active, and things that look like coincidences, you really have to wonder, it's not just a coincidence. And we look back on our own lives and reflect, and we see God saying no to us at just the right time. So on the other hand, you see God everywhere and in everything, and working behind the scenes and in front of the scenes and in our lives. And so I think for me, that's what gives me hope. Is it's really easy to get discouraged in life and to think that God's not there and God's not present. But above and beyond and all and everything, when you really stop and look at things, God is everywhere and God is in everything. And Jim, your idea of you have all these different doors and all these possibilities. It's not like one of those doors like doesn't involve God, even if it maybe doesn't even look like it at first. Like God is in and behind every single door that we might open. So that I think that maybe end on that note. I hope that gives you some hope in your life, and that maybe our time with Esther and Mordecai and in this odd story of reversals will inspire us to see God in all kinds of different places where we might not notice. So any other closing thoughts? Otherwise I'll close us out in a word of prayer.
I just have this from Morning in Jesus. Last week when Pastor Ryan, we were talking about joy being active. The faith step that I read a couple days later was, what can you do today to renew your joy in belonging to Jesus? So making that an active part of what we do. And think about in the morning. I have to remind myself every day, take that pause in the morning and be conscious of what I'm going to be doing that day and what my actions are, instead of just charging into the day. So that usually doesn't ever work.
Thank you. Yeah. Will you pray with me? God, we thank you so much for hope, giving us hope when we need it the most, when it doesn't seem like you're anywhere around us, but at the same time, you're everywhere and you're in all things, God. Thank you for our church community, for our wonderful people at Abiding Savior, for their stories, being able to see them weave together in the story of faith that we find in the Bible. God, thank you so much for this time. I pray a word of blessing and encouragement on each one of us, that we may go out and that we may see our faith as an active thing that then gives hope to ourselves and to all those around us. God, we give you this time and we thank you. Amen.
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 Thank you.
So next week, Pastor Lisa will be teaching, and I don't know what her topic is for next week, but I would just say keep your eye on the emails that come out, and if there's a Bible story or something like that, I think she'll let us all know if you want to read it in advance. If you would like, I didn't get to maybe half or so of what I put together for tonight. If you'd like to take a look at the rest of the notes, they are again on the church webpage. You can click on those. If you wanted to look back at Ryan's note too from last week, if you missed last week, his notes are up there as well. And so is last week's video. So, excuse me. Yeah, thank you. Any other housekeeping things or questions that anybody has? Or?
Thank
Over
you,
your-
Deacon Brad.
What was it?
Brad, over your left shoulder above your head, You got, yeah, the light reflecting. Is that a map as in the Boundary Waters?
It is. So when my wife and I got married, we took our honeymoon to the Boundary Waters, and that is the map that we brought with us and used. Bearskin, Duncan, and Rose Lake that we went on. And she,
Okay.
Stairway Portage.
the staircase portage, yep. And she will never let me live down the fact that we did our honeymoon in the Boundary Waters.
I'm proud of you.
I don't know what, just seeing that, I've got a couple Boundary Waters because I worked up there back in the 60s and out of Moose Lake
Ah,
in Ely. And it just had that, the layout of the lakes.
Yep, you got it.
So I get I'm that lucky. I better run over to the store and